I might be the first cuckold in the history of screwed-up matrimony to actually send his wife's lover a thank you card. Honestly, I really did. I'm almost never sick, but there was a particularly nasty strain of flu going around the office where I was working one Thursday morning, and I was showing the symptoms rather vocally. So, rather than infect the whole room, my boss sent me home. It was around noon, and I figured my wife Beth could nurse me properly, get me the chicken soup I needed, take my temperature, and generally fuss over me before putting me to bed. When I pulled onto the street where I lived and approached my house, I noticed a green pickup truck parked in the driveway. I really didn't think anything of it at that particular moment. I couldn't think of anything except how awful I felt. The vehicle wasn't familiar, and since it was taking up space where my beat-up SUV normally sat, I parked by the curb. I went in through the garage, which opened into the kitchen. There was no sign of Beth in the kitchen or the front den. At that point, a queasy feeling unrelated to the flu began to build in my gut, especially when I approached the back of the house where our bedroom was located, and began to hear the telltale sounds of sex. I tiptoed toward the door, which was cracked ever so slightly, and peeked in. Well, of course, I saw Beth on her hands and knees with some slim guy I'd never seen before kneeling behind her, screwing her for all he was worth. And was she ever loving it? "Oh God, screw me," she wailed. "Come on, give it to me." The man grunted incoherently. I was looking at them from behind, and they were so wrapped up in what they were doing that they didn't see the door crack open. My reaction was strange. Part of me obviously wanted to go in there and break up their party, but another part of me was just numb. I should say here and now that I was not aroused. When you love someone for as long as I love Beth, the sight of that person cheating on you is not a turn-on if you're wired normally. And I wasn't always a person who took fidelity seriously. In the space of a heartbeat, the time it took Beth and her boyfriend to come violently, I had an epiphany, a moment of clarity when my future suddenly spread out before my eyes. I made a decision at that moment that my life was changing for the better. I took out my cell phone, pushed the door open, raised the phone with the camera mode on, and took about 4 really good pictures of the startled lovers. Having gotten visual evidence of my wife's adultery and that of her lover, I turned on my heel and walked briskly out of the house the same way I had entered. I stopped and grabbed a screwdriver on my way out of the garage, then casually used it to poke large holes in 2 of the tires on the asshole's truck. I know it was childish, but it was the least I could do. Then I got in my SUV and drove off, though not before jotting down the license plate number of the pickup. It was the first day of the rest of my life. As I drove more or less aimlessly, I thought about what I'd just seen and realized that it had been brewing for a long time. I had no idea how long Beth had been cheating on me, whether this guy was the first or just another in a string. It didn't matter because, truthfully, I didn't care. I guess at this point a little background is in order. My name is Peter Thornhill, and at the time of this story I was 48 years old and had been married to Beth for exactly half that time. At one point we were passionately in love. Indeed, it was almost love at first sight. We met not long after I graduated from college and started with a major manufacturing company located in a mid-sized Midwestern city. I had been raised in western Nebraska, and I had hoped to find something closer to the mountains where I had camped just about every year as a kid. Beth was from the city where we had lived the entirety of our married life. I honestly can't pin down when my marriage turned. It was a very long, very slow decline that wouldn't have been noticeable to the outsider, but it was there and I could sense it. Toward the end we all had dreams, and mine was to live in the mountains and write the great American novel. I think Beth's big dream was simply to land a husband and raise a family there in her hometown. You know how dreams usually go, they fall apart on the rocky shores of reality. The reality for me was that I ended up stuck in this nondescript Midwestern burg, writing computer programs for the same company I had started with after college. I got to a certain point on the corporate ladder, and then got lost as more ambitious men and women passed me by. Part of my problem was that I wouldn't cut corners. I was a perfectionist where my work was concerned, and I didn't suffer fools who took the easy way out. Another part of my problem was that I became so good at my particular job that I was indispensable in that position. As a result, I got passed over for promotions, although I did receive regular raises and occasional bonuses. But the other part of my problem was that I had a fairly passive personality. I was content to go along to get along, and that extended to my marriage. Don't get me wrong, Beth was a nice-looking woman with dark brown hair and an ample figure, and I had always loved her. She never quite lost all of the weight she gained having our 2 children, but I still thought she was sexy. Apparently so did someone else. We bought a house not long after we were married. It was in a decent neighborhood, but certainly not the high-rent district. The house was built in the 1960s, and some of the things in it hadn't been replaced in all that time. So we gradually replaced one appliance after another with no particular rhyme or reason. We were always fixing this and patching that. We always talked about buying something better, but after refinancing the mortgage as collateral for loans a couple of times, we found we had priced ourselves out of any chance of selling it. In other words, what it would have taken to pay off the loan and get something better was more than the house was really worth. We could have sold it for less to someone as a fixer-upper, but that still wouldn't have solved the problem of finding someplace better to live that we could afford. Then there was the problem with our children. 3 years into our marriage, we had a son, Jason. 4 years later came a girl, Laura. These kids were the poster children for why adults in the animal kingdom sometimes eat their young. I tried to be a disciplinarian as much as I could, but Beth's idea of discipline was to give them whatever they wanted, and she refused to let me spank them for any infraction whatsoever. The consequences were pretty drastic. Jason was lazy, disrespectful, and slovenly. Laura was a neurotic nymphomaniac. They learned at an early age how to play Beth and me against each other to get what they wanted, and as a result we lost control of them. By the time they became teenagers, Jason was about to lose his 6th minimum wage job since he barely graduated from high school. Seems employers like for their workers to show up on time and in reasonably presentable attire. They're funny that way. He was living in a dumpy old house in town with 3 of his slacker buddies, and I was pretty sure he was at the very least smoking pot and drinking a lot. Laura was about to flunk out of high school altogether because she couldn't keep the MP3 player out of her ears long enough to pay attention to anything in class. She was also dating some scuzzy college guy with tattoos all up and down both arms. Beth was a nurse who eventually decided she preferred working the night shift. On the days she worked, I would get home around 5:30, and sometimes we'd have dinner together before she left for work around 6:15. Due to our conflicting schedules, we began spending less time together, and our intimacy dwindled. We would connect physically once or twice a month, typically on a weekend afternoon when she was off. It was always okay, there's no such thing as bad intimacy, but it was fairly routine. We'd go through the motions, with me taking the lead, and it would usually end quickly. Occasionally, Beth would be in the mood and take the initiative, but those moments became increasingly rare. Things were relatively stable until about 18 months before this particular incident, when Beth's mood began to shift. She had always been a bit temperamental, but menopause seemed to hit her hard. She started finding reasons to avoid intimacy, at least with me, citing headaches, tiredness, or going to bed much earlier than I was ready for. Along with this, she began to criticize more often, finding fault in things I did or didn't do. Looking back on it, the signs were there, I just didn't see them. I'd sometimes call the house during the days when I knew Beth should have been up and around, and I'd get no answer. Sometimes she'd stop in for drinks with some coworkers at an all-night bar that catered to night shift workers. A few times she'd come home on weekends when she'd immediately start a load of laundry like she had something she wanted to wash before I could see it. Everything pointed to Beth's adultery, but like I said, it really didn't matter. So, let's review. I was stuck in a dead-end job in a nowhere town. I was living in a rundown house that was overpriced. My sex life was in the toilet. My witchy wife was cheating on me and my children were budding delinquents. What would you do? Probably what I did. Actually, the very first thing I did was go to the walk-in clinic to see about my flu. I got a steroid shot and a prescription for an antibiotic. Feeling a little better, I went to Walmart to have my prescription filled and to buy some things I needed. Toiletries, a hot plate, a small pot, some soup and sodas. Then I drove all the way across town and got a motel room. I had stopped at the bank on my way to Walmart and withdrawn some cash to pay for a place to stay for a couple of days. Once I got settled in, I sat down and wrote out a game plan for the next few days while I heated a can of soup. I ate as much as I could, put the rest in the mini refrigerator, crawled into bed and crashed. It was dark when I awoke, and I was a little disoriented until I remembered where I was and why I was there. I was still weak from the flu, and really I was too dazed by my illness and the shock of seeing Beth like that to fully absorb what had happened. I heated up what was left of the soup, drank a Sprite, and watched a football game on TV before going back to bed. I checked my cell phone and saw a dozen calls from Beth. I smiled grimly at that. Let her sweat, I thought. I woke up the next morning feeling quite a bit better. The first thing I did was call the office to tell them I wasn't going to be into work. My boss's secretary answered the phone, and after I explained why I was calling, she told me that Beth had called all afternoon looking for me. She did she? I said. If she calls today, and I imagine she will, just tell her I've called in sick and won't be in today. That'll at least get her off your back. Pete, where are you? She asked. Let me put it this way and see if you can figure it out, I said. I'm not at my house. Okay then, she said, and I hung up. I had made it very plain that I no longer had a home. I had thought a lot about my course of action, and the more I thought about it, the better I liked it. I really couldn't be mad at Beth. It was pretty obvious that she didn't want to be married to me any longer. For some reason, she wanted something I couldn't give her, whatever that was, and I wasn't going to hold her back from whatever it was that she wanted. She wanted to screw other men? Fine, I'd give her the freedom to do so and free myself in the process. But I still had some work to do. There were going to be consequences for both Beth and her lover. Nothing terribly drastic, but consequences nonetheless. The first thing I did was call the motor vehicle department to inquire about buying a pickup truck. I'd lost the owner's phone number, but I had the license plate number, as well as the make, model, and color of the truck. The friendly woman on the other end of the line cheerfully gave me the man's name and address. My next move was to call a friend of mine who was a lawyer and get the name of the best divorce attorney in town. I called that worthy lady as it happened, and scheduled an appointment for 1 o'clock that afternoon. I showered, then went down to the lobby for a very light breakfast before heading to the bank. I had 2 certificates of deposit that I had bought a number of years earlier. I cashed those in, withdrew half of the money from our joint savings account and half of what little there was in the checking account. I put most of the money into a new checking account that I opened in my name only, along with a bank debit card. I walked out with a little over $4,000 in traveler's checks. I spent the next few minutes calling credit card companies to cancel all but one of my cards and have the accounts put in my name only. I also paid off the balances on each of those cards. The one I generously left for Beth I didn't bother paying off. Let her worry about that one. Next, I went to a branch of the public library where I bought some computer time. I took the 4 images I'd taken on my cell phone, downloaded them onto an email address I had, and printed out 2 copies of each one. I have to admit they were very clear and explicit. Then I looked up information on the fellow who'd been with my wife the previous afternoon, one Clark Slater. I found out he was married, so I jotted down his wife's name. I then put a copy of the pictures with the note attached, letting her know where I could be reached for more information, into an envelope with her name and address on it. I went to the post office, bought some stamps, and mailed it to her. Then it was time for my appointment with Grace Shaw, the attorney. I told her what I'd done and what my plans were, and she just nodded her head. When I showed her the pictures, her first question, however, was one of caution. Divorce seems like a pretty drastic step on such short notice, she said. Are you sure you don't want to try to work it out? What's there to work out? I said, my wife has a lover and I don't want to stand in the way of true love. I have some places I want to go and some things I want to do with my life, and staying here with a cheating wife isn't part of those plans. In the end, I agreed to a legal separation for 90 days. The divorce papers were drawn up, and if after 3 months I was still determined to end my marriage, then the papers would be filed and Beth would be served. Now, if you go forward with the divorce, what sort of settlement do you want? Grace asked, what sort of settlement do you want? I've already taken half of the liquid cash in our bank, I said. She's got a 403(b) that she's paying into from her work. She can keep that, but she also doesn't get any of my 401k either. She can keep the house, the mortgage is in her name anyway and I don't want it. If she does sell it though, I want half of all proceeds from the sale. Okay, Mr. Thornhill, I guess that covers it, Grace said. I'll look forward to hearing from you in about 3 months. My last stop was to the office but not to work. I walked into the Human Resources Department and asked about what would be involved in taking early retirement. I had 26 years with the company, so I had a good bit of retirement built up. I was told I could begin drawing on my retirement pension when I turned 60, which was 12 years away. I frowned at that, but brightened when I asked about cashing in my 401k. Of course, the lady at HR strongly discouraged that because of the hefty tax penalty I'd have to pay. Nevertheless, if I wanted, I could get an immediate cash out of approximately $65,000. I thanked the lady and headed back to my motel. I was tired, and after fixing another pot of chicken soup, I went to bed and slept for nearly 7 hours. It was after midnight when I awoke, and I knew I now faced the hardest part of my day, going back to the house and collecting my things. Beth was supposed to be at work, but I wasn't sure if she'd actually gone in. As it turned out, she hadn't. Beth was asleep when I slipped in quietly, and the house was silent. Apparently, Laura was so concerned about my whereabouts that she'd gone out, like she always did on Friday nights. I wondered if the kids would even miss me when I was gone. Probably not. The first thing I did was get what I needed out of the garage: tools, camping gear, and other assorted useful items. I went into the little office area and got my laptop. I plugged it in and downloaded some files from the home PC onto the laptop, then carried it to my vehicle. I had a couple of boxes with me that I loaded with CDs, a portable player, a lot of books, and some mementos that meant something to me, including a few pictures, though none of Beth. After I loaded that stuff into my vehicle, I got some suitcases out and walked softly into my former bedroom. I was about halfway finished with packing when I heard a small gasp behind me, and then Beth's voice. "Peter, where have you been?" she said. "I've been worried sick about you." "Have you now?" I said, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. "What are you doing?" "Beth," she said. "What's it look like I'm doing?" "Packing," I answered sarcastically. "Packing," Beth said in a trembling voice. "Give that girl a gold star for brilliance," I said. "Peter, I'm so sorry," she began. When I stopped her, I said, "Beth, I don't want to hear your excuses or your apologies. It really doesn't matter why or how or even who, although I do know that much. You want to love someone else? Fine, I'm letting you. But I don't love him. I don't want him," she began. "I love you. I don't want him. I want you." "Could have fooled me," I said in an acidic tone. "It sounded to me like you wanted him pretty badly yesterday afternoon. Let me see if I can recall the exact words. Oh God, screw me. Isn't that about it?" Beth just buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I looked at her evenly. Whatever brief flash of anger I'd had was gone, replaced by, I'm not sure, pity. No, not that. Disdain. Maybe a little disgusting. Yeah, a bit. But mainly I realized that the biggest thing I was feeling was emptiness. I realized at that moment that I didn't have any feelings for her whatsoever. I just didn't care anymore. I finished packing and let her son into her pillow. It wasn't until I started up the bedroom door with the suitcases that she jumped off the bed and tried to stop me. "Wait!" Beth cried. "Don't leave me. Pete, please, can't we work this out? Please, I'm sorry. It wasn't anything. It was just sex." I just stared at her silently as I carefully extricated myself from her clinging arms and walked to the front of the house. Beth followed me, sobbing hysterically. I pointed out the notice of legal separation sitting on the kitchen table among the dirty remnants of that night's pizza dinner. "I'll be back in 3 months, mid-December," I said. "If I'm still thinking then like I am now, I'm following through on a divorce. I will let you know generally where I am, but I'm leaving and I'm not sure yet where I'm going to be. Goodbye, Beth. I'll see you around." "Pete, no." Beth cried as I walked out the front door with my suitcases. I didn't look back as I climbed into my vehicle and headed back across town to my motel room. The next day was Saturday, so I slept in. When I got going, I packed up what I had in the motel room and checked out. At $85 a night, the motel was a little steep, and there was a place near my office that catered to visiting business people. They have long-term rates that are considerably cheaper than the average motel. For approximately $45 a night, I rented a clean room for 2 weeks that had a nice little kitchenette, internet, cable access, and a large television with pay-per-view porn movies if I was so inclined. I did sample the sexy wares being offered on the TV, but mostly I kicked back and indulged in football all weekend, doing absolutely nothing else. Then I went to work the next Monday morning. The first thing I did was walk into my boss's office and hand him my letter of resignation, effective in 2 weeks. Needless to say, everyone at the office was stunned. I'd been there so long and in the same job that I guess I'd become part of the landscape. My boss, for one, was in a panic. He spent the whole 2 weeks trying to talk me out of retiring, but I was adamant. On Tuesday of the first week, I got a call from my daughter. It was a rather enlightening conversation. "Daddy, why are you leaving us?" Laura asked. "You'll have to ask your mother that," I replied. "She said to ask you," Laura said. "Okay," I said. Thursday afternoon, I caught her in bed with some other man. I was sick with the flu, took off work early, and there she was. "I've got the pictures to prove it." "Wow," Laura said. "I didn't think she had it in her." "Well, that explains why she's been so weepy. Daddy, she's a basket case. She just sits around crying and cursing herself. You know, she called in sick all 3 days this weekend." "Look, tell your mother to get a grip on herself," I said through clenched teeth. "If she thinks she can guilt-trip me into coming back to her, she's very mistaken. I've already put in for my retirement, and a week from Saturday I'm out of here. After that, what she does, what you do, and what your derelict brother does are none of my concern." "Well, I love you too, Dad," Laura cried. "Hey, you never gave a flying fig about me before. Now why should you start now?" I said, "You're just afraid of the gravy trains fixing to roll out of the station." "That's not true," Laura said a little pensively. "I need you. You're the only one in this house with any sense, and I don't know what's going to happen without you." "Oh, I'm sure you'll manage," I said. "Look, Laura, I'm sorry about what I said. That was mean of me. I'll be in touch and I'll be home for Christmas, okay? I love you really," she said. "I know, Daddy," she said with a sniffle. "I love you too." Jason never did call. I had a pretty busy 2 weeks. Beth tried to call any number of times, but after I hung up on her a few times, she got the message that I didn't want to talk to her. Her friends from work tried to get me to at least see her, but I refused, and I said so in pretty harsh terms. It turns out Clark Slater was a nurse up in the unit where Beth worked, and they'd been seeing each other for about 6 months. Most everyone I talked to said they thought he was the only one she'd stepped out on me with, but they didn't know for sure. I very pointedly told all of them how much I appreciated them telling me what my wife was doing behind my back. They didn't have much to say after that. I got a call in the middle of the first week from Clark Slater's wife. Apparently, Beth wasn't the first nurse, married or otherwise. He'd been able to tap, but Beth was going to be the last, at least while he was her husband. I had finally given her the solid proof she needed to show him the door. Funny, but I never heard from Clark either about Beth or his ruined tires. I had an awful lot to do before I left my work behind. I had to train someone who could handle my job until they hired a full-time replacement. I had to get my 12-year-old vehicle serviced. I had to scout around for a broker who could set up my 401k in a private account, and I had to get with HR about my severance pay and cashing in my remaining sick time. I spent most of my downtime watching TV, fooling around on my laptop, or shopping for things I would need when I left town. I also visited a few of my friends, all of whom expressed their disbelief that Beth really would cheat on me. All too soon, the second Friday arrived, my last day of work, and with it came a little sense of regret. I'd put in 26 years at that company, and I'd made a lot of friends there. At lunch that day, my boss called our department together, and we had a little retirement party. That's when I finally lost my composure. I was trying to give a thank you speech when I suddenly broke down and cried, the first time I'd cried over anything in years. I wept both because I was leaving and because of the circumstances that had driven me to my decision to retire. I had kept myself so busy over the previous 2 weeks that I hadn't given myself a chance to let out the emotions over Beth's cheating, and seeing my colleagues gathered in my honor was just too much for me to overcome. But I got over it pretty quickly, especially when Marcy Glover came over to me and invited me to an after-work gathering with a few of them at Chili's. Of course I said yes, even though I made it clear that I don't drink. Marcy was a fellow computer geek, but she was a damn good-looking geek. She was in her early 30s, a tall blonde divorcee with a 10-year-old daughter who was spending the weekend with her father. As she told me that, she gave me a very smoky look. I'll admit that kind of confused me. I mean, I'm not bad-looking. In fact, I look considerably younger than my years, but a stud muffin I'm not, or at least I didn't think I was. I'm a little shorter than average, about 5 feet 9 inches. I wear glasses, I have a little bit of a belly, and while I'm no weakling, I'm no fitness freak either. But I was about to find out that I had more sex appeal than I'd ever imagined. There was a group of 7, 3 women and 2 men, besides Marcy and myself, and for once in my life I was the man of the hour. We sat for several hours drinking beer. Well, I had tea and told stories about the plant, the town, and each other. In the midst of the festivities, we also took time to have dinner. As the night wore on, I was sitting next to Marcy, and it became rather obvious that she was coming on to me. She was sitting real close, putting her hand on my thigh or on my arm. I couldn't decide whether she was just doing that because she was drunk or whether she was serious. Finally, about 9 o'clock, we started drifting our separate ways. I wanted to get an early start the next day and got up to leave. Then I looked over at Marcy and saw that she really shouldn't drive home, so I offered her a ride. After getting hugs and handshakes wishing me well, I walked Marcy out to my car. When we got in, she moved in real close to me, put her hand on my thigh and gave me a penetrating look. "I'm really not all that drunk," Marcy said. "I just wanted you to give me a ride and not home either." "So where do you want me to take you?" I said, deliberately playing dumb. "Take me to your motel," she said, and she pulled my face around and kissed me hard and deep. "Marcy, you don't have to do this," I said when we broke apart. "I mean, yeah, I'm lonely, but I don't want any sympathy." "Sympathy's got nothing to do with it," she said. "Pete, I've had the hots for you ever since I started working there, and I've finally got a chance. I'm not passing it up." "You've had the hots for me?" I said. "Come on, Marcy, look at me. I'm a fat, gray-haired old man." "In the first place, you're not fat," she said. "Secondly, your hair makes you look sexy. In the third place, you're very good-looking, and in the fourth place, you're one of the nicest men I know. You're one of the few men in that building who's never made a pass at me or any of the other gals, for that matter. Trust me, we've noticed. You've always been a gentleman." "I've always been a married gentleman," I said with just a trace of bitterness. "Look, you're going off tomorrow, and you deserve some TLC before you go," Marcy said. "Now are you going to take me back to your motel and screw me or not?" I laughed then and started up my vehicle. The truth is, I'd had many fantasies about Marcy Glover, but I always figured she was out of my league. Besides, I was a married man who believed in fidelity. Technically, I guess I was still married, but I was already legally separated, and in my heart I knew my marriage was over. Marcy Glover was offering me her body, and I'd be damned if I was going to pass it up. As soon as the door to my room closed, we were instantly drawn to each other, kissing passionately, our hands exploring one another. It wasn't long before I found myself admiring Marcy's slender figure as she sat back on the bed. Her presence was captivating.